Hello everyone, and welcome back to The Portal. Today's story is called C.A.G.E, written by ButIDntWanaBeAPirate. And so, without further ado, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. As the bell rang, the sixth graders hurried to their seats, and Mrs. Kurzweil slowly hobbled her way to the front of the classroom, taking care not to let her walker become snagged on a table leg or an errant backpack strap. As she wrote the subject for the day at the top of the whiteboard, mounted low to meet her hunched, age-contorted frame, the students' Monday morning chatter died down, and a solemn tone filled the room like a cold fog. Upon finishing, Mrs. Kurzweil stepped back and squinted through her cataracted eyes to be sure the letters were clear, and that she hadn't misspelled anything, before turning to face her class. She paused for a tense moment, as she collected her thoughts. This would be the 5th year that she would teach this horrid lesson, and each year it crushed a tiny bit more of her. She hated every moment of it. But the children had an absolute right to understand, and so it had to be done. She found it most effective to lead the session with questions and let the students fill in the blanks most meaningful to them. "Children, I think you all know the subject of today's lesson," she began, as she noted the pin-drop silence that had overtaken her classroom. "This is, in a horrible way, the most important history lesson you will learn in the course of your schooling. Before we get into things, I want all of you to know that you mean the world to me, and that because my own daughter Kate is gone." Mrs. Kurzweil paused as she became overwhelmed with emotion, leaning on her walker and fighting back hot, stinging tears, remembering she must be strong for her students. "I'll just say that I consider all of you my children, as much as she was. If you need a moment to take a break, feel free to step out into the hallway and take as much time as you need." As she surveyed her class, Mrs. Kurzweil saw scars in the eyes of her students that no lesson she could teach would ever do justice. And she realized that only a fortunate few in her class truly had anything to learn from this lesson. There was little she could say that most of them didn't already know, in some sickening capacity. This lesson, rather, would be about the painful, horrid, downright lurid specifics, the people, the places, the things. This lesson was the part that none of her class or dear students would want to know, but which they all must: civic duty. At this thought, bile formed in Mrs. Kurzweil's throat, and she croaked out the final instruction to the class before she began. "Please, no notes for this lesson, as it will not be on the unit test." She knew that reason was false. They would remember this lesson without the notes, and in so many ways, that would be the real trouble indeed. Mrs. Kurzweil reached down into a small storage pouch, mounted to her walker, and produced a clear 1-liter Ziploc bag, containing a quarter-sized metallic object. As she removed it from the baggie, taking care not to bend or break the numerous tiny, needle-like filaments protruding from one of the object's flat faces, she could feel the student's eyes locked onto her hands. This is an example of a C.A.G.E device. C.A.G.E. That's an acronym. Who knows what the acronym C.A.G.E stands for? Among the more mature, astute students, a few hands rose. 1. A smile beamed across his face as Martin eagerly watched the Neuropoint marketing team's reactions. Lars, the research chimpanzee, struck the final note emphatically before standing, gently closing the Steinway grand piano's key cover and turning to the crowd. bowing confidently in perfect mimicry of some infantile, prodigal human, as he showed himself off stage in an eerily, distinctly human manner. The entire marketing team was dead silent, too stunned to even think of clapping. Nobody thought anyone would be able to do anything remotely close to this for at least 20 more years. There would be consumer doubts indeed, but handling that little hump was the marketing team's job after all. Martin beamed, careful not to bask in his own self-acclaim too conspicuously. Clicking the mouse, Martin advanced his accompanying presentation to the next slide. 2 months ago, we surgically implanted our C.A.G.E module in Lars's prefrontal cortex. C.A.G.E stands for Cognitive Augmentation and Generation Engine, and it essentially acts as a bridge between the brain and any compatible digital device. After Lars got his, he was able to learn the lovely piece he performed in front of us in, get this folks, just under 4 hours. That was only the beginning of what Lars would ultimately be able to do with the C.A.G.E. But after discussing it with Lars, that's right, we discussed it with him, we concluded that this was by far the most impressive way to demonstrate his newfound abilities. And music has become his favorite hobby. As it were, my friends, the day of the true brain-machine interface is here. The applause was swift and enthusiastic, though Martin could see a distinct unease forming upon the faces of some of the less intrepid in his audience. He noted to himself that he would forgive these colleagues, though, as he knew what it was to witness what they had seen. How ought one react after watching humanity untether itself from the cosmic order of nature by way of a single, tight, 2-hour presentation? As the rest of the audience filed out of the conference auditorium, muttering amongst one another about what they must have been, by absolute miles, the most interesting marketing meeting in a career, the CEO himself, Dan Sarsgaard, pushed through the crowd and onto the stage, grabbing Martin's hand and shaking it vigorously. "Your team has just changed the world, Marty. Can I call you Marty?" His day-glow whitened teeth could put an eye out. "Get ready to get very fucking rich, my friend." Mrs. Kurzweil paused the video and pointed to the tuxedo chimpanzee in the frozen frame on the projector screen. This video was the first that the world saw of Neuropoint's C.A.G.E technology, and it was on every news program and in every print news publication worldwide at the time. Within about 5 years, at least half of the adult population in every developed country had received the C.A.G.E implant. A few hands shot up. She picked a hand from the back. "Mrs. K, why didn't everyone get a C.A.G.E?" asked the girl, named Keisha. The other hands lowered, as this had apparently been the question on everyone's mind. Mrs. Kurzweil nodded as she leaned into her walker, yielding the appearance of a reader at a lectern. Did everyone hear what Keisha asked? That's an important question, everyone, so pay close attention. The classroom returned to a solemn silence. The first factor is that the case device was extremely expensive. Nobody but the wealthy could easily pay for their own, and so most people, especially early on, attained them in one of 3 ways. Many big companies paid for all of their employees to have one. The most colleges offered the device as part of a scholarship program, as for everyone else. The rest were purchased on payment plans and credit cards. "What about kids like us?" asked Keisha. Nobody younger than 20 years of age, roughly, was eligible to have one implanted, because it was designed only to interface with fully developed brains. And 20 is when most people became neuro-eligible. There was a children's version in development, I've read, but thankfully it hadn't been released by the time everything fell apart. Is that the downfall, Mrs. Kurzweil, when everything fell apart? Asked a boy named Connor, gesturing to the lesson's title on the dry erase board. Yes, that's correct, Connor. And that's about the best anyone could figure in terms of what to call it. Not like the movies, no fancy name. And nobody in the mood to come up with one, for that matter. It was a downfall of everything we held dear. And so that's what we called it, Mrs. Kurzweil replied, as she hobbled towards the window on one side of the classroom and commenced to close all the blinds. For this portion of the lesson, sunlight was the last thing she could stomach. The sun rays were rings of cigarette smoke, and she was a smoker's retching widow. It had been nearly 7 years since the piano-playing chimp, and everyone who could get a cage had one. And it had led humanity to amazing places. People could upload years of education straight into their brains in under an hour. And they could upload multiple university degrees worth of information at one time. It was extraordinary to behold. For people like me who were around at the time, she paused, breathless in momentary reflection, as the last truly happy time of her life, and her daughter, ran like an old film reel through her mind. After taking a sip of water and refocusing herself, she continued. Humanity was reaching new intellectual heights, and scientific and medical breakthroughs were being made by universities and individuals alike. It seemed that nothing would stop us from seeing beyond our wildest human dreams. But children, like with so many stories of human achievement, the consequences of our hubris finally caught up with us. Fairly quickly, a problem began to arise. 2. The woman stared up vacantly from the gurney, mouth agape as she gasped in large and deliberate gulps. Quinn carefully maneuvered his gloved finger towards her eye and touched it gently. No blink. No reaction of any kind. What the fuck happened to her? He asked Marcus, the other neurosurgeon. Marcus thought for a moment, allowing the echoey silence of the basement at Neuropoint Research to overtake the exam room as he pondered. She lived underneath a stretch of those old overhead power lines, and the neighborhood grid surged. Her next of kin agreed to have her brought here, had her caged for about 11 months, and never had any strange pathologies we could find. That's all we know, Marcus muttered, needing not say more. Having seen almost the same thing 3 previous times, both men knew that a serious problem seemed to be making itself apparent. What they didn't know, or perhaps wouldn't allow themselves to know, was that this particular problem would have the greatest of possible implications. What the men would not allow themselves to realize was that the end was already upon them. Quinn gulped, knowing that this case was the most direct evidence of what the research team had come to fear. So we're saying EMP, electromagnetic pulse again. He felt the pulsating feeling emanating from his own cage implant, even though he knew it must have been psychosomatic. Mark used his cage to open a direct message to the chief of risk management upstairs. That's what I'm telling Stephanie, yeah. Unless you've got another idea. I doubt it though, I think we'd both love that, he said, blinking as his brain typed before sending the message. A reply appeared in both men's vision displays nearly instantly. What do you know about solar flares? Read the reply, below which was a hyperlink to a NASA academic release titled Coronal Mass Injections, Increased Solar Activity Anticipated. Stephanie followed up with, Upstairs, my office, 5 minutes. Both men turned pale. Quinn cursed loudly and fell to his knees. Marcus thought of his wife and wept into his hands. The last of the students filed out of the classroom, off to what Mrs. Kurzweil desperately hoped would be the reprieve of lunch and a bit of outdoor time. As she went to turn off the presentation projector, she paused, momentarily carried off into thought by the final slide of the day's lesson. Still displayed, the major news headline from the morning of the downfall. Solar flare expected today. NeuroPoint CEO reassures public C.A.G.E tested and safe. As the memories and feelings of the day came over her, Mrs. Kurzweil began to sob quietly enough that a passing colleague wouldn't hear. Even now, 5 years on, she couldn't bear to think of all the children who were to be raised by their grandparents or by older siblings in their absence. She bawled even harder, remembering that an entire generation would lose all of their parental figures before turning 30, and that such generational damage would be lasting and deep. Mostly, though, she just retched at the memory of the smell. The putrid, throat-wrenching, gnawing reek of the mass open body dumps. It seemed to be burned into the walls of every room. 3. Until sunset Pacific, all power grids nationwide will be shutting down to prevent damage in the event of a solar coronal injection event. Please deactivate all battery-powered devices and avoid large, dense metallic structures when possible. There is no cause for alarm. This public address station will resume broadcast 30 minutes after sundown Pacific. Thank you, shouted the announcer. The power suddenly cut, and Leslie Kurzweil turned off her handheld camping radio as she rushed into the kitchen, where her daughter, Kate, was finishing up making sandwiches. Gosh, I sometimes wish I still taught, mused Leslie. I bet the kids would be having so much fun. Kind of like a snow day at school, I bet. Yeah, but then you'd been straight forced to get a cage implanted, replied Kate with a chuckle. And since I couldn't convince you, I'd be shocked if they could have either. You know I never shut up about how much I love mine. You may be right about that one, dear, retorted Leslie, as she turned the corner towards the garage to look for extra candles on the tool shelf. You know how your father felt about those things. As the words left her mouth, she watched the battery-powered LED wall clock begin to cycle and flash erratically. Leslie knew exactly what was happening. The solar flare. Just then, she heard the crash of a plate. As Leslie rushed back into the kitchen, she turned to see her daughter's face as it began to contort. Kate's eyes rolled up into the back of her sockets, leaving behind a veinous white stare. And she looked as though she'd lose her balance and fall. As Leslie went to brace her daughter, Kate's lower jaw opened wide and began to open even further still. Leslie froze, watching in helpless terror as Kate's jaw dislocated and stretched as though she were a feeding snake. Kate's left fist balled into a trembling clench as blood began to pour down her right nostril. Her right hand twisted into a grabbing motion. At first, Leslie thought Kate might go for her own jaw and rip it clean off. But then, to her horror, her daughter began to punch and rip into her right temple, with more strength than Leslie had seen from any wild animal. After gnawing a plum-sized hole into her skull, Kate ripped her hand away and fell to the floor, stunned and screaming in silent, whimpering shrieks. Leslie rushed and knelt next to her daughter. In her bloody, brain-splattered right hand, Leslie could make out a shiny, quarter-sized metallic object, its tiny, needle-like filaments glistening with Kate's freshly oxygenated, strawberry-red arterial blood. The children would return from their lunchtime soon, and Mrs. Kurzweil set about collecting herself. Dabbing her raw eyes with a handkerchief, she sat at her desk and produced a newspaper clipping from one of the drawers. The students need not learn about this little tidbit until they were a bit older, perhaps in high school. On the page read the headline, Neuropoint CEO body found in secret bunker lair. And below it, a half-ripped article with a photo. The photo that led Mrs. Kurzweil to keep the cutout. In it lay Dan Sarsgaard's corpse, his gored, exploded head blurred out of focus. In his hand, though, was not a cage, but a pistol. Mrs. Kurzweil chose to believe that old Dan had the very worst fate, ultimately. The paper said he shot himself a day after the flare, down in his hideout, even as he'd remained miraculously uninjured by any of it. Perhaps, she thought, he really did believe it may have been able to work out all right after all, if he just kept his mouth shut about the cage's horrid flaw and let it pass. Or maybe after he saw what it really did to people. He decided to blow the world's last working cage implant straight out of his Forbes fucking skull, to ride his selfish little brainstem into oblivion, like a bucking rodeo horse. Yeehaw, partner. At this, a smile crept across Mrs. Kurzweil's face, and she set about preparing her afternoon lesson agenda, with love for her students flowing freely through her old heart, once more freed from the cage of the dark place in her mind.